Welcome everyone. This lesson is a couple of days behind schedule. Terribly sorry about that. Life got a little exciting for me, but everything's back in the swing. So this week we're studying, we studied rather, the last several chapters of the book of Alma, which were pretty bumpy, to be honest. They were really just one thing after another. Kind of reminds me of our current year of 2020 and how that seems to feel for all of us. Very much, I don't know, bumpy, we'll call it. So let's start with chapter 53, verse 1. And, excuse me, the Nephites have captured a lot of Lamanites, and the Lamanites, these are Lamanites who refuse to bear their weapons of war and refuse to make an oath or a covenant of peace. And so the Nephites were like, okay, I guess you'll be prisoners. So instead of prison being a really relaxing place with 3 squares a day and entertainment from, television and internet and whatnot, these guys put them to work. So it was kind of like a slave labor camp of sorts. And so the Nephites, in verse 1, it talks to them about how Moroni figured out that if we can keep the Lamanites busy, they don't have time to get into trouble, and it takes less guards to keep them tabs on everyone and make sure they're doing what they should be doing. So that was how they decided to take care of that. And so he put them to work fortifying cities and building stronger, taller walls that were beefier and more, more of a protection, more of a fortress than they already were. And so I thought to myself, sometimes for ourselves or our families, we think, we're doing okay. We're doing most of the stuff we should, and I guess we're doing all right. But as I studied these parts of the chapter, I thought to myself, well, maybe my fortifications aren't quite as good as they could be if I would use this time to strengthen and fortify myself, my family, my relationships with them, and with other people. And so I thought, that's a lot of wisdom to kind of like apply to our day, is how are you, during these times, are you using this time to fortify and build your walls around your family and around your, to protect you from the adversary? Is that getting stronger and better, or becoming more relaxed? So, I thought that was interesting. In chapter 53, verse 7, the Lamanites never stopped making preparations for battle. The Nephites are trying to rebuild their cities and plant crops because we've got a lot of people to feed and trying to take care of things. And it says that but he did employ his men in preparing for war, even with all those things. And I thought to myself, don't you stop. Don't stop preparing and expecting the adversary to battle with you, because he doesn't stop either. So don't stop. Keep doing all the things that you've been doing. Keep doing the things that we know we should be doing. That was a pretty strong message that came through with that. In 53 verse 9, it talked about how there was a lot of pondering as to how are the Lamanites getting the best of us. And in verse 9 it said, it's kind of a very simple and direct answer. It says, and thus because of iniquity amongst themselves, yea, because of dissensions and intrigues among themselves, they were placed in the most dangerous circumstances. And I thought to myself, those are really great words of wisdom that could be true for something as small as a marriage or a family or a ward. that if there is iniquity among ourselves, we're making it harder for the Spirit to help us and for God to help us when we are um, not letting Him have full sway on our hearts. I thought that was interesting. And when I read this, I thought, these men that are making all of these decisions and things, they're affecting their wives and their children and their families. It's kind of disheartening to watch the whole thing start to crumble this week. It really gets pretty rough, and it's just big decisions that you make that impacts other people. In verse 13 of chapter 53, we get to see how the people of Ammon are kind of feeling, and they feel so helpless, I guess. They know that they made this covenant to never pick up arms, never to try and battle to protect their families and preserve their freedoms. They just didn't want to shed the blood of any man. They felt like so strongly that was wrong, and so they made that commitment. And everyone has honored their commitment, and they have decided that they would protect this entire giant population over there because they value covenants with God. And so these people of Ammon are starting to feel really uncomfortable because they recognize there's a bunch of us here. We could so be helpful to Moroni and all of the armies that they could use our help. There's a lot of able men, and we could probably just call it good with the covenant, and everybody was really upset. Particularly Helaman. He's like, oh no, don't you dare take that and undo that covenant. We don't know what would happen if you did. We count on you to be righteous. But as I listened and thought about verse 13, it says and it came to pass that when they saw the danger and the many afflictions and tribulations which the Nephites bore for them, they were moved with compassion and were desirous to take up arms in defense of their country. They wanted to help. And I thought to myself, wouldn't that be hard for you? If you were them, wouldn't that be hard to know what was happening and that you weren't helping? And would that have bothered you? In chapter 53, starting in verse 16, and it kind of goes on for a couple of verses, skips a chapter, skips another chapter, but I discovered that there are 9 reasons that the 2060 warriors were awesome. This is Helaman's, a lot of people call them Helaman's 2,000 stripling warriors, but actually there were 2,060 of them. And we'll get to that. But what made them so great? And so if you have a pen and paper and want to jot these scriptures down and review for, later, here's the 9, where the 9 things happen. Alma 53, verse 16. There's 2 of them in verse 17. There's 3 awesome qualities in verse 19 and 1 in 21. Then jump ahead to Alma 57, verse 27, and then jump ahead to Alma 58, verse 40. And then you'll discover these 9 qualities, what makes a stripling warrior the fellow that he was. It was interesting in chapter 53, verse 16, that it was the young men themselves that assembled themselves together and talked about what was happening, and was there a way that they could help. And so they figured this out themselves, and then they presented their plan to their families, so that their families could remain those covenant keepers, and they could also help and defend the country, because they were never born yet. They did not make that covenant that their moms and dads did. And so they felt like this was a way that they could help to protect the nation that they loved so much. But it's really cool that it said that they assembled themselves together. and came up with this plan and then presented it. And it was amazing who they picked to be their leader. He wasn't a military fellow at the time. He just was the prophet. So they felt like the prophet should be their military leader, and Helaman said, okay, I'm in. I'm all in. So I thought that was amazing that, that they picked their Helaman to be their leader. Helaman really was, he was a missionary and a spiritual man, but it never, up to this point, we have no history of him being a military-minded fellow. So this is his first experience. Maybe it's not his first experience in battle, but it looks like that to us. The 2060 stripling warriors, we meet 2,000 of them in chapter 53, verse 18, and there's an extra 60 that come in chapter 57, verse 6. So together, and then from that point forward, from chapter 57, verse 6 on, Helaman refers to his 2060 warriors. So that's how that happens. Okay. I always wondered, what does the word stripling mean? That's such an odd word. We don't use it today, ever. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and it just simply means a youth, an adolescent, a teenager. And I think about the teenagers that I see in our world today, and I'm so impressed with these boys that were of the people of Ammon. They're just amazing young men, and I hope our young men, my young men, are those kinds of fellows, and we try so hard to kind of keep that spirit of honor alive. The other thing I thought about is that these 2060 stripling warriors had covenant-keeping moms and dads, and when you have a covenant-keeping father and a righteous mother, together they make stripling warrior kids. And so that's our goal, right? We get to see in chapter 54 the first Book of Mormon hate mail that comes along. So, and this is a mail exchange back and forth between Moroni, who's the chief captain of the Nephites, and Ammoron, who is the chief captain of the Lamanites. Some people kind of make a joke of Ammoron's name, and they say it's a moron, but that's not how you say his name. So, and you may not be aware of this, but in the back of your Book of Mormon, the very last page of the Book of Mormon itself, I'm trying to flip ahead to it to show you. I'm so close. Hang on. They have this cool thing, a pronunciation guide, and it has everybody's names and phonetically how to say them. And so that comes in really handy at the moment, because it's just, there's so many crazy names that we're just like, wow, how do you even say that? So if you ever run into a name and you're like, I don't know how to say that, check out the pronunciation guide. That's only good for the Book of Mormon. It's not good for the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, but I'll take what I can get. So it's interesting, the in the hate mail exchange between Moroni and Ammoron. Moroni just he just really laid it all out there before he ever gives him the ultimatum. He's like, this is all of the things that's happening, all of the, everything that has been going on forever. And so the final thing is, we want to trade whole families for one Lamanite soldier. So an entire family unit, mom, dad, all the kids, for one Lamanite guy. If you want your Lamanite guys back, that's how it's going to happen. For Ammoron's perspective, he is really tired of trying to feed all those people. And he thinks, all this food I'm wasting on these Nephites. And I'm sure he didn't feed them like, they should be fed, just kind of barely surviving perhaps, because he's got a lot of soldiers. They require a ton of calories to do all the things that they're doing, trudging around and battling every day, and so he's really stressed out. Amram is really stressed out because he just doesn't have enough supplies to take care of all of his people, not to mention these whole families of Lamanites or Nephites. And so it's interesting though that Amram brings up this. It's almost 6 centuries old by now. The griefs and contentions of way back at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, and he also kind of throws in there Zoram, that he's like and because Zoram was captured and held against his will, and I think. I remember when Zoram went with Nephi willingly because he was kind of the servant, an indentured servant of Laban, and his whole life was he was going to be a servant, and that was it. And so Nephi kind of said, if you want to be your own fellow, raise a family, live like you would like to live, come with us. And so he made a covenant and said, okay, I'm in. And so it's interesting how that's kind of been really flipped to completely the opposite of the truth. But there you have it. And in the end, Moroni said, you know what, deal's off. I really would rather just end the conflict, not just trade people so that you can have more strength to your armies. So the deal is off, which made Amram really mad. He was hopeful, so hopeful. And so Nephi really needed to, not Nephi, Moroni really needed to find a way to rescue these whole families that were held hostage in these cities. And so he came up with this really great idea. And he said, let's see. Let me see that. Chapter 55 and verse, at the very beginning, the first several verses, they've kind of come up with this plan, and they said, all the Lamanites that guard this city where all these people are, they're so bored. This is the short straw to be on guard duty, and it's so boring, and they never have anything fun to do, and they just sit around and just hang out by themselves. It's really not much fun. And so Moroni says, hey, let's send them free wine. We'll make it really intensely strong wine with the intent of knocking them out, so they will sleep long and hard and deeply. That's the plan. But they have to find someone to deliver the wine that the Lamanite guards will be okay with. And so it's interesting that in verse 8, and the fellow, that's a power of one guy, right, that Moroni found, he was a Lamanite by birth, and he was actually in verse 5 of chapter 55, it says that he was one of the servants of the king who was murdered by Amalickiah. And because he's a servant of the king, he is, he's not your average Lamanite, right? He knows all kinds of language and customs and just all kinds of benefits that he has because you don't know what those Lamanite guards are going to be like. What kind of dialect of the Lamanite language do they speak? And is there a way that he can kind of convince them that he's a Lamanite? And they're doing this in the dark. So in verse 8, it says that in the evening, Laman went up, over to the guards, and they where the guards were camping, out on the edge of the city gates, and they called to him, and they said, who goes there, right? And he said, hey, don't worry about things. I'm a Lamanite, and I've escaped from the Nephites, and they're all asleep, and I've escaped, and so I'm coming home. And it's interesting because they said, let's see where my notes are. They did not. He was not welcomed closer because of the color of his skin. They couldn't see him yet. They could just hear his voice, and they knew that by the sound of his voice that he was indeed a Lamanite. So I thought that was really interesting. And I thought to myself, you know how people we have a saying nowadays that we say, you know, that gal really speaks my language. I totally get it, right? And so it's one of those things that makes you feel comfortable in a person's presence, or you are more intrigued about what they have to say because they speak your language. That's what the missionary's job is to speak the language of the people. And that's also, as teachers or as moms and dads, that's our job, is to learn how to speak the language of the people that we have responsibility for. So that's kind of what was happening. It was interesting in verse 17. It said that they were able to, the guards accepted the wine, really had a great time with it, fell fast asleep, and they were able to throw to the people inside the city walls all these weapons of war. And it said that they even had women and children, anybody who could wield a sword or a spear, they had one in their hands. And it said at the very end of that verse, it said, and all these things were done in profound silence. I thought that was interesting. I found that, in today's world, I get sometimes swamped by Instagram feed and Facebook feed and social media about how awesome I am, or how awesome my family is, or how amazing whatever, and all these people, that's kind of how they kind of shout from the rooftops how amazing they are. And I thought to myself, here's Moroni just doing his job in profound silence and gets the job done. So I thought, okay, note to self. Anyway, so he's kind of given them the power to defend themselves and to take care of what will happen in the morning. And so who gives you power to help in your battle every day? If you think about who are those people that help to kind of strengthen you and encourage you and give you those kinds of, that kind of support. So I thought that was interesting. In chapter 55, 29 and 30, it said this same phrase in both verses. And it said, and many times the Lamanites did such and such, and many times they did attempt to do these kinds of things. So over and over and over, the Lamanites were just relentless in how they were trying to tackle the Nephites in battle, or trying to poison their food, or trying to steal their supply lines. I mean, just over and over, just relentless. And so that's how persistent the adversary is in our day. Absolutely never rests, never takes time off, never decides that it's okay, I guess we're going to leave you alone for a while so we can work on other people. He doesn't think like that. Satan never thinks like that. I love in chapter 55, verse, is it 17? Is that right? Nope, sorry, 27. It looks to me like, is that right? I'm trying to figure it out. My notes sometimes get the best of me. Scratch that. Moving right along. Okay. Oh, it's chapter 56. That's why it doesn't make sense. 56 verse 27. Now that makes a lot of sense. You remember the 2,000 warriors, and now they have added 60 more to their army, or they will soon. But it's interesting, when they were bringing provisions and adding more men and weapons and things to resupply the Nephites. In verse 27 it says, and now it came to pass in the 2nd month of this year, there was brought unto us, and this is Helaman and his band of his sons, his warriors, brought unto us many provisions from the fathers of those my 2,000 sons. So this is a way that those dads were still committed to supporting and helping. They weren't breaking their covenant, but they wanted to, I'm sure the mamas were like, you go check on him and make sure he's okay. I need to know my boys are safe, and I need to know that how they look, and are they sick, and and the papas are like, yep, I'll go, here's more bread, here's more cheese, here's a pack, so mamas and papas worked really hard together to get these provisions gathered together and to send the dads in to make sure, connect with their sons and just encourage them the best that they could. How touching is that? And I've read that scripture so many times and just passed right over the significance that their dads brought them those provisions and love from home. I just thought that was just so tender to me. And let's see, that same chapter 56, this army of Helaman and these boys are getting chased by the whole army of the Lamanites. And it's scary, right? And it says in chapter 40, it says, and they durst not turn to the right nor to the left, that they should be surrounded. And he says, and I wouldn't turn to the left or to the right because I didn't want to be surrounded. And so they just kept marching on this straight path, and the Lamanites are marching straight behind them. And so I thought to myself, it is so like the spiritual war that wages in our day, that it's so important to not veer to the right or to the left, but to stay on the straight and narrow path. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, verse 29, it talks about Satan and how he maketh war with the saints of God and encompasseth them round about. So obedience and diligence and faithfulness, those are all examples of turning neither to the left nor to the right, and they will always lead you away from temptation and away from becoming surrounded by the enemy. That is good, solid advice even today. Thomas S. Monson has a great quote, and it's kind of, when I've read verse 45, and I'll read it to you, and then I'll read you President Monson's quote. Chapter 56, verse 45 says, and now I say unto you, my beloved brother Moroni, that never have I seen so great courage, nay, not amongst all the Nephites. He's referencing the 2060. And President Monson said this, life's journey is not traveled on a freeway devoid of obstacles, pitfalls, and snares. Rather, it is a pathway marked by forks and turnings. Decisions are constantly before us. To make them wisely, courage is needed. The courage to say no, the courage to say yes. Decisions do determine destiny. The call for courage comes constantly to each one of us. It has ever been so, and so shall it ever be. That's Thomas S. Monson's quote. I think that in chapter 56, one of the most it's a very well quoted verse, and it talks about how those boys talked about their moms, because he said, how is it that you're so faithful and you're so obedient, and it's just so amazing, and it said that they had been, in the end of verse 47, it says that they had been taught by their mothers, and that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them. And so I thought to myself, and then in verse 48 it says, and they rehearsed unto me the words of their mothers, saying, we do not doubt, our mothers knew it. And so take some time to think about, in your own life, what did your mom teach you? What were some of those really important moments that have just kind of guided you through your life because it's something that your mom taught you? Or the same thing, what did your dad teach you? How did your dad provide protection for you from maybe not just physical protection, maybe spiritual protection, maybe emotional protection. Think about the different ways, different things that your moms and dads have done for you. And then the last thing is, have you taught it forward? Have you taken the things that they've taught you and taught those things to your children, or your Sunday school class, or however, wherever you are serving? Do you teach those things forward? Julie B. Beck gave the most amazing general conference talk in October of 2007. It's been a long time ago, but it's worth the read. And if you get some time, read it again. It's Julie B. Beck, and the name of her talk is Mothers Who Know. And I'm going to read you a little excerpt from that just to kind of get you excited about reading it. So, October 2007 General Conference. She said, "The responsibility mothers have today has never required more vigilance. When mothers who know who they are and who God is and have made covenants with Him, they will have great power and influence for good on their children. Mothers who know are always teachers. Since they are not babysitters, they are never off duty. Think of the power of our future missionary force if mothers considered their homes as pre-missionary training centers. Then, the doctrines of the gospel taught in the MTC would be a review and not a revelation. That is influence. That is power." End of quote. So, in chapter 56, verse 51, it talks about how Antipas, who was one of the Nephite military leaders, he had fallen. It said, "And Antipas had fallen by the sword, and many of his leaders, because of their weariness, which was occasioned by the speed of their march. Therefore the men of Antipas, being confused because of the fall of their leaders, began to give way before the Lamanites." And that was such a sad verse to think about. These men were trying so hard to do so good things. And I thought about, this is what I had jotted down in my journal. I said, sometimes even those of us who are strong and valiant can fall by the sword because of much weariness in our daily and constant battle with the adversary. And because of this, because Antipas had fallen and his leaders were out of sorts, and the men in the army, and the Lamanites were on him, and it was bad. And who comes to the rescue of these weary soldiers? Helaman's army. And these boys had never really battled with these big, burly, strong, mean Lamanites. They had never battled anyone in their life other than maybe sticks, and with each other, with fake swords when they were kids. They'd never really killed a person, ever. And here they turned themselves around and rushed to the aid of Antipas and his men. And so I thought to myself, who do I know in my life that would turn around and come back and check in on me and come to my aid if I needed it, like these 2,000 young warriors did for these men? Our help is not always from those elderly people, the seasoned, or the peers. And then I thought about the hymn 254, that says, "Shall the youth of Zion falter?" Our youth are amazing people, and I just love, anytime I get to spend time with youth, I love it. And I just am so impressed by just the small and simple things that they don't even know somebody's watching them, and aware of how different and how special they are. So, okay. In verse 52, so, they pursued him, and the whole army, the whole Lamanite army, turned around and started to battle with Helaman and his young warriors. And I thought to myself, this is the world that our youth live in today. This is how, when they go to school, when they're in their peers, with their peers, that's how their every day is like. So in chapter 57, verse 6, that's when we add more provisions and more men to the army, but it says that that they added 60 more sons of the Ammonites to Helaman's 2,000. And he says, and now behold, and after we've got these extra 60 guys, kids, teenagers, Helaman says, and now behold, we were strong. I love that. I love that, for whatever reason, maybe these boys weren't old enough, or their moms were just so worried and just couldn't bear to let these boys go, but 60 more wanted to come and wanted to join in the fight. And so I thought to myself, sometimes it's important to stop and think, well, who is missing? And how do I help find them? So in verse 21, it was kind of a little bit of an insight on how these teenage boys behaved. When I think of, if I had 2,060 teenage boys all in one place, I think about like youth conference or these big events, and I think, wow, those guys, wow, that's a lot of work. But they were different. They were so different. In verse 21 it says, and they did obey and observe to perform every word of command with exactness. And even according to their faith, it was done unto them. And I did remember the words which they had said unto me, that their mothers had taught them. And I love that thought, because their obedience and their covenant-keeping hearts, that was their heritage. That's how they grew up. And the ability, the desire, the integrity to live those beliefs in any and all circumstances, that's just what everybody did at home. That's just how we were, right? So I think about our baptismal covenant. That's in Mosiah chapter 18, verse 8 and 9, and it talks about how, that we're willing to stand up and make a difference in any place you are, in any circumstances that you find yourself, and so that's what they did. And I found a quote, and I don't know who said it. I didn't write it down. Drat. I tried to. He said, blind obedience is sheep following sheep, but following with exactness is sheep following the shepherd, and that Jesus Christ is the good shepherd. I thought that was interesting. And even in my own patriarchal blessing, we don't talk about those things very much, but there's a phrase in there that talks to me about the importance, that teaches me the absolute importance that my life has to teach my children the fullness of the gospel in all these teaching times throughout all their lives. And that's my charge. And I love that line in my patriarchal blessing. And so when I read about, these mothers who taught their boys how the importance of being obedient, it gives me courage, I guess, to go and do likewise. John, by the way, said a really interesting quote. He says, as we battle our own battles here on earth, don't be surprised when you get wounded from it. We are all going to suffer, but we don't have to be miserable. So, those 2,060 stripling warriors, they went through a really intense battle, and most of them suffered wounds of some kind. And so that really comes home to me, that even though we battle, we're going to be fine if we're battling for the right reasons. it's interesting how, sometimes you think I have a job to do and I totally messed up and I blew it and I did a terrible job and I ruined everything, right? So there's a Gid, who is a chief captain under Moroni. His job is to transport a bunch of Lamanite prisoners from the battlefield to the stronghold city of, I think it was Nephihah. Or no, Zarahemla is where they're headed with them. And so Gid and all of his army with him get all the Lamanite prisoners together and begin marching towards the land of Zarahemla. But they didn't. They came back a lot sooner than they were expected, and Moroni's like, I don't know what happened, but pitch in and help. We're having this serious, intense battle here. And so finally, when it's time, things settle down, and Gid has the opportunity to share, what he felt was, he was just such a total failure. He was, they were guarding these prisoners, they got under attack, and they were surrounded, and they just had no choice but to let the prisoners all go and to head back to safety, which is where Moroni was. And I thought to myself, sometimes we think we have failed miserably, only later to discover it was indeed a blessing. So the blessing was Gid and all of those Nephite soldiers didn't die, didn't get hurt, and they were able to come back in the nick of time and help Moroni and all of those other armies battle this really serious battle. So I thought that was helpful to think sometimes when it doesn't doesn't go quite according to plan, maybe it is going exactly according to plan. So in chapter 58, verse 5, it says, But behold, this did profit us but little. For the Lamanites were also receiving great strength from day to day, and also many provisions, and thus were our circumstances at this period of time. And my thought about that was, again, Satan is always strengthening his position, and he is employing every tactic he can, and he does not rest. So when we look at these war chapters, it's really so helpful in our day-to-day living today. Let's see. Even through all of this tough life that these soldiers and families and cities are coming under siege and being overrun by Lamanites and captured and all of that. In verse 11, it's interesting that this is tucked in here. It says, Yea, and it came to pass that the Lord our God did visit us with assurances that he would deliver us. Yea, insomuch that he did speak peace to our souls, and did grant unto us great faith, and did cause us that we should hope for our deliverance in him. And I thought to myself, how many times have I experienced that exact thing when I think it's miserable, life is terrible, all this stuff is going wrong, it cannot get any worse. And then I get this feeling of peace and serenity that comes not from me, and because I'm trying to do the right thing as best I can, Heavenly Father blesses me. And I have taken advantage of remembering those things as much as I can so that when life falls apart again, I have this arsenal of, but do you remember when's? That really do help. Let's see. In chapter 58, verse 40, it's kind of a code that the 2060 stripling warriors lived by. And it says that they stood fast in that liberty wherewith God has made them free, and they are strict to remember the Lord their God from day to day, the day-to-day stuff, right? Yea, they do observe to keep his statutes and his judgments and his commandments continually, and their faith is strong in the prophecies concerning that which is to come. it's a wonderful code to live by. In So Helaman writes a letter to Moroni, and he's really frustrated. You know, the battle's tough, and he's, you know, they're so hungry, and there's not, you know, the reinforcements are kind of, he's just frustrated. So he sends this message to Moroni and just kind of vents a little bit. And Moroni, in chapter 59, verse 3, he turns around and it says that he immediately sent an epistle to Pahoran, that's the chief judge, desiring that he should cause men to be gathered together to strengthen Helaman, or the armies of Helaman, insomuch that he might with ease maintain that part of the land which he had been so miraculously prospered in regaining. Moroni didn't send Pahoran any requests for help for himself, but just for his friend Helaman. And so I thought to myself, you know, sometimes we find that that we can help another person due to our own gifts from Heavenly Father, our skills, our ministering efforts. This is why we minister. This is why we share. This is why when someone says, "How are you?" you tell them instead of just saying, "Oh, I'm fine." If when Moroni would have asked Helaman how he was doing, and Helaman would have said, I'm fine, he wasn't fine. He needed help. And so sometimes it's okay to say, I need help. So it's, you know, when life gets really rough, who do you reach out to? Who do you, you know, who do you join yourself closer to when life gets tough? So Ezra Taft Benson has a really great quote that I love. This is in chapter 59, verse 9. I had the right page. Moroni was trying so hard to maintain the city of Nephihah and to not let it fall into the Lamanite hands, because he just knew if it did, it was a really well-protected city. And if Nephihah fell to the Lamanites, there would be little hope to get it back. And so President Ezra Taft Benson's quote says this: "It is easier to prepare and prevent than it is to repair and repent." And that's exactly how Moroni was trying to take care of this section of his responsibility. In chapter 60, Moroni gets really irritated, and he sends another letter to Pahoran, and he really lets him have it. It just seethes of this resentment and this. He's just so frustrated. It says, it's kind of I wrote down, it's the age-old misunderstanding between the office and the field. And I have to admit, I've been guilty of that myself. Even with, the job that I do every day, that conversation happens sometimes between this is life in the field, and this is where the rubber meets the road, and this is how, we help, people in our community with what they need. And our world is very different than the manufacturer's world, or the lawmaker's world. And so sometimes I talk about that in my own world. But Moroni is really irritated because he just thinks, Pahoran, what are you doing? Why are you sitting out and not taking care of your armies? We're out here dying, trying to defend our nation, and what are you guys doing? You're just hanging out and enjoying the peace and comfort and safety of your capital city. He just really lets him have it. And I thought it was interesting the whole chapter of 60 is Moroni just really letting it all out. Just all of his frustrations and all of what he thinks is wrong and what is happening and why he's not getting any help. And if you don't come help me, this is what I plan to do. And it's not that he was mad. He was justifiably upset. And he's like, look, if you guys are struggling, and I'll come in and I'll clean house for you if that's what you need. If you got problems at the capital city, I'm on it. I will come and clean up house if that's what it takes. We need help. And so, and I love in chapter 61, as you read, Pahoran gets the letter, reads through the whole thing, and then he responds. And I love his response is just so gentle and so meek, and he did not take offense in any way, and it was beautiful. And he said in verse 9, he said, "Now in your epistle you have censured me, but it mattereth not. I am not angry, but I do rejoice in the greatness of your heart." He sees Moroni as such a patriot on fire, and with the zeal of God, and he's like, "I admire you, and I'm not mad." And sometimes I think, isn't it Hugh Nibley said this, I thought it was interesting. He says, "It was, to say the least, not the most tactful letter in the world, but Moroni's patience was worn out. Also, it turned out that he was right on every point in his letter but one. And that point was an important one. He had accused the wrong man." And so he was spot on, but instead of directing it all to Pahoran, he needed to move that over to someone different, right? In the Lamanite world of things. In chapter 60, let's see, did we cover this? Probably. Yeah. All right. Chapter 61, Pahoran writes back, and he says, here's what's happening. We've had a hostile takeover of the government. You remember all those kingmen fellows? Well, now they're not just doing petitions and urging the people to change the law. They're just overthrowing the government. That's what's going on in my neighborhood. And I know your neighborhood that you're in is really, really bad. Well, mine is too, and I'm so sorry I can't help you right now. And so I thought it was interesting that this is a quote from M. Russell Ballard. He says, "We need to remember," let's see if I can give you a scriptural reference here. In chapter 61, verse 14, it says, "Therefore, my beloved brother Moroni, let us resist evil, and whatsoever evil we cannot resist with our words, yea, such as rebellions and dissensions, let us resist them with our swords, that we may retain our freedom, that we may rejoice in the great privilege of our church, and in the cause of our Redeemer and our God." And so the quote from M. Russell Ballard is this: "We need to remember Edmund Burke's statement, 'The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.' We need to raise our voices with other concerned citizens throughout the world in opposition to current trends. We need to tell the sponsors of offensive media that we have had enough. We need to support programs and products that are positive and uplifting. Joining together with neighbors and friends, we can send a clear message to those responsible." And so that's what the plan was. I'm mindful of the time, and I'm trying to shut things down as quickly as I can. One of the things that when the Lamanites surrendered, the Nephites said, why don't you just go and move to the land of Jershon and live with the people of Ammon. They will be happy to take you in. In chapter 69 or 62, verse 17. I mean, that's another time that they encouraged them to go and to dwell with the people of Ammon. And it said that there were about 4,000 of them that came to live with the people of Ammon from this one battle, which is a huge, huge number. But they knew full well the righteousness and the exactness example that the people of Ammon would set for these new neighbors of theirs. And so I thought to myself, is my ward like the people of Ammon? Do we have do we set that example of exactness and obedience and welcoming, and no matter who you are and where you are, come on in. Let me take care of you. Let me help you. Let me teach you how to be close, to be a covenant path person. I thought that was interesting. Here's another thing that I thought was amazing. So chapter 62, verse 21. So they need to drop over the city walls, and they need to surprise the enemy. So Moroni, he says, let's just prepare, and they just came up with this plan. Here they are trudging around the wilderness. They've been marching around for years. And he says in the middle of 21, he says, and Moroni returned to his army, and he caused that they should prepare in haste strong cords and ladders to be let down from the top of the wall into the inner part of the wall. And I thought to myself, I never envisioned that army marching around with huge ladders in tow. And those city walls, they were tall, right? They built them to be incredibly high and imposing and hard to, And so Moroni's like, hey, let's just take up our ladders and all of our big strong ropes, and we're going to do this. And so come prepared. And they did. They came prepared for battle. So what does it look like for me today? How do I come prepared for battle? And are there things that I should have handy at my fingertips to help in my battle for me and my family against Satan? And sometimes that looks weird to other people. Sometimes it looks like big tall ladders that we lug from place to place with our army. They might come in handy someday. So what are some of those things that might come in handy someday? The pain and suffering of sometimes family home evening, that was hard, but it was worth it. And just, small things. Thought that was good. I feel like we're kind of running close to an end here. And in chapter 62 and 63, we're really slowing things down. In chapter 62, verse 42, it talks about how peace was established and everybody went home. And it was a 20-year long war. That's how long this war was. And amazingly, Moroni was still alive after all that he had battled. Same for Helaman. Moroni was tired. And he really, in chapter 63, verse 3, that's when it lets us know that he passed away. So when he retired from the army, when Moroni retired from the army, he was only 45 years old. And his peaceful retirement, that really lasted only about 5 relaxing years before he passed away. Helaman tried to go home and rest, but he is the prophet, and he's like, you know what? I still can't rest. I still need to go out and continue the battle. So that's what he did. I do have an interesting quote that I ran into that I thought I didn't remember reading it earlier. It's in chapter 63, and in reference of verses 5 through 9. And these are these folks that decided Haggoth is his name, and he was an exceedingly curious man, and so he built a lot of boats, and he convinced a lot of people to hop on board, and they would go explore and relocate. And so here's the quote in reference to Haggoth and his party. President Spencer W. Kimball said, President Joseph F. Smith, the president of the church, reported, You brethren and sisters from New Zealand, I want you to know that you are from the people of Haggoth. And for New Zealand saints, that was that. A prophet of the Lord had spoken. And interestingly, among those people that went with Haggoth was Corianton, who was Alma's son. That was Helaman and Shiblon's brother. He was among those people that went. Next week, much easier, relaxed reading schedule. The Lamanites actually capture the Nephite capital city of Zarahemla. We meet Gadianton, the root of all evil for the Nephites. And we have righteous Lamanites who begin preaching to the wicked Nephites. And the wicked Nephites are busy supporting the Gadianton robbers. What happened? Anyway, hope you have a great week. Talk to you soon.